best way to stay healthy is by making sure you're putting the right things in your body, which is easier said than done when you're trying to figure out the right diet and supplements to take. Good news. Cardimax Immune Booster has you covered. Right now, American Party Podcast listeners get 30% off your next 4 orders. Use the promo code AMERICAN at cardimax.com. That's CARDOMAX.com, helping you achieve your max. I like how that's a pre-recorded pre-roll, and I kind of fuck up in the middle of it, and we just have been using it for 3 months.
We never re-recorded it, yeah.
Jesus Christ. All right, so today we have, as you can see in the title of the show, Dr. Debra Soh, the author of The End of Gender. Before we get into all the things we're going to discuss today, I want to, you read your own audiobook, right?
I did. Were you able to get a copy of it?
Yeah, I buy everybody's audiobook. I have like the max subscription on Audible. I buy everything. But yeah, I have to commend you on, I only heard your Canadian accent one time, and it was not really ironically even, just like, of course, it was when you were saying the word sorry, right? So
yeah.
It's the quintessential Canadian word, I guess, or at least.
You are not the first person to say that to me, which is absolutely hilarious, because a lot of people on my book tour were saying, I had no idea you were Canadian until I heard you say the word sorry.
Yeah. You said about correctly, correctly, like I'm the arbiter of what fucking words are supposed to sound like. But it was very good. I really appreciated the book, and it's almost one of the stories, or I'm sorry, a trope that you hear a lot is that, I was, about academia, the grad student being, especially these days, woke or so wrapped up in the letter of the law that they kind of miss the spirit of the law a lot, right? There's very, like, you're learning new things and you feel like you're an expert and blah, 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 but you kind of went the opposite direction. You got more open-minded in grad school when you actually started being exposed to data instead of rejecting it. And I think that speaks a lot to your character, frankly. I mean, when you're faced with all of your institutional beliefs that you've held for a very long time, and all of a sudden you're seeing data that is in stark contrast to that, and you're able to be like, hey, you know what, this is fucking wrong, and change your opinion, that's a pretty good character trait, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so The End of Gender is about 9 myths that we prominently see circulating in society. And these are myths that I myself once believed. And like you said, once I went to graduate school and actually started learning about the science of gender, I realized that these ideas are incorrect. So some of the examples are this idea that gender is a social construct, that children with gender dysphoria should transition, that there are no differences between transgender women and women who were born women. What else is there? The idea that men and women should approach sex and courtship and dating in the same way. The idea that gender was a spectrum actually wasn't that popular back then. I'm not sure that even really existed. That's really only been, I would say, probably in the last 2 or 3 years. But that, along with this idea that biological sex is a spectrum when both of them are binary. That basically the book is a science-based approach to debunking these myths. And I'm really glad that I had that training in graduate school. I worry because I think even students who are doing their master's and PhDs now in a scientific discipline are being wokeified. And I was very much in favor of social justice before. I'm still obviously in favor of equal rights for people and ending discrimination, but I don't think this extreme hard left turn that we've gone throughout institutions, in the media. I work as a journalist now, pretty much everywhere you look, and the science denial that has gone along with that, to me, is very, very disturbing, because that's not actually going to be helpful for groups who are being marginalized.
No, it's like a collective cry wolf almost, but I think it's the cry wolf thing is more of like a social hypochondria, but this is something else. It seems very deliberate, and I don't understand what the goal is exactly. I mean, it seems like maybe there's not any goal, right? I don't know what the old maxim is, never blame conspiracy where incompetence will whatever the fuck. I don't remember how it goes, but I sound like George Bush right now. You can't fool me twice. I don't know. I don't know that there's necessarily an intent behind it. I mean, it seems like there might be, but it also might just be weak character that believes everything, and then maybe it's just a misguided sense of justice. Like people want, I think people have an intrinsic desire for justice, and when they feel that their own lives haven't been fully just, or if they're told, that their lives haven't been just, and they seek to, kind of correct that. And I think that's a good impulse. But man, there's a lot of metaphors you could use there, but it's like, you know, trying to close the door and it won't close right, and you just keep slamming it until the glass breaks. It doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? There's got to be like a thoughtful solution to all this.
Yeah, it's really destructive. I would say, I think a lot of people who are going along with this have good intentions. They are empathic people, and they probably think that these are the quote unquote proper or right views to have, especially if you are sympathetic to, say, the transgender community
Right.
or people who are gender nonconforming.
Yeah, you hear the
I do think,
phrase "the right side of history" quite a bit, right? And
yeah,
I think it's kind of a
yeah.
catch-all for just whatever I. It's like how to label your own opinion and have it. Well, we're just trying to be on the right side of history. Where's the data, right?
They also want to shame the people who are going against it, to say that you are in some ways morally corrupt or unethical, or you're going to look back on this with regret. I do think the people who are spearheading this movement, the social justice movement more broadly, and especially with regards to, say, gender ideology, they know what they're doing. They know that it's a power grab. And in terms of, say, academics and scientists, I mean, I didn't think it would ever reach academia in the way that it has, and in the way it's infiltrated scientific and medical organizations. It's beneficial to people's careers. And so whether or not they actually believe what they're saying is besides the point. I can definitely tell you it's a much trickier path. It's a much more difficult and challenging path to go against this stuff. But for people who are ethical, I mean, if you know what the scientific research says, there's no way that you would be on board with any of this stuff, because it's completely nonsensical.
Right. That's one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I asked this of a lot of people. Bogosian is a buddy of ours. He's a obviously he doesn't do the type of he's more of a soft science guy, but very very smart, very reasonable, and I would say he probably leans pretty far to the left, as do a lot of these new IDW folks. But do you think that this whole woke trend, if you want to call it that, is corrupting academia, or do you think it's exposing it? Right? Is it exposing the inherent flaws? Because Bogosian and Lindsay, the way they were able to sneak in some of those ridiculous fucking research papers and get them approved,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, it's hilarious, but it's hilarious in a way that
Sad.
the man on the street stuff, what with Jay Leno back in the day, was like, damn, are we really this fucking stupid? The answer is yes. By the way, we are dumb. But what are your thoughts on whether it's corrupted academia to some degree, or if it's just exposing the flaws in it? Because remember, this isn't new. Academia got infiltrated by National Socialism back in the 20s and 30s. It's been infiltrated by communism from time to time. And a lot of that was alarmism from the McCarthy period here in America, but there were actually a lot of communist ideologues in academia, but it's always a small percentage that permeates throughout. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Peter and James's work. I've had them both on my podcast, as well as Helen Pluckrose. I think it's both. I think to some extent that fringe wokeism has always been in academia, but it was not empowered in the way that it is now. I think it was just left unchecked for too long, and decent academics are very busy people because they're trying to keep their jobs. Essentially, academia is very competitive. They're working 60, 80-hour work weeks, and they have all this administrative stuff to do, and they also have teaching in addition to their research. So they don't have time to be going on social media and defending themselves against mobs or I mean, these other disciplines, I would say, I don't want to say that they're not as strenuous or they're not as competitive, but I mean, you can compare the level of scholarship. And so they have more time on their hands to be regurgitating this garbage and to be putting it out there into the discourse. So part of it is, that those fringe lunatics have managed to build up enough momentum and to brainwash incoming students to the extent that this ideology has gone mainstream now. But I also think, I mean, the other part of your question was, is it that the university is also complicit in pushing this out there? Was that what you're saying?
Not the university system in general, but I just think maybe it's exposed I mean, I'm sure you know these guys. You're familiar with the University of Austin. That's where we're here in Austin, and we're helping the guys promote that stuff and
Amazing.
Barry Weiss and stuff. We love all those people. And we don't agree on everything. I mean, I probably run a little farther left than most of my audience does, and the people that we speak to on a regular basis probably run a little farther left than I am. But we don't really give a shit about that because there's hot and cold as well. Life is pretty. We say it's binary, and when I guess maybe binary is not the right way to categorize it. It's probably more polar, right? Where there's there's very clearly two poles, and maybe people fall somewhere in between it on these political spectrums, but there's still a right and a left, and it's still important to be able to find a balance between those things, the empath and the fucking strength, right? Those things have to operate together. I just kind of get the sense that maybe because of the competitiveness to get tenured positions or whatever, or the way that when you introduce profit motive into certain things, like medicine, for example, and academia, things start to go wrong pretty quickly unless you keep a close eye on it. And I think a lot of college professors see their students as their clients or their customers, and that's not necessarily the case, right? I mean, technically, the student is the customer of the university. I suppose that is true technically, but that's not the way it should be viewed from the professor's point of view, I don't think.
No, so I see what you're saying. I do think in some ways the institutions are a part of the problem because they don't back their faculty when their faculty are being, say, mobbed or threatened or intimidated. So what we see, especially with science now, when you have these studies coming out that are backing some of these loopy ideas about gender, it's because the scientists know that, like I said, that promoting a particular narrative is going to be good for their careers, but also that if they don't go along with it, that they're probably going to lose their jobs. And so in my book, there's a chapter that's dedicated to the topic of cancel culture in academia and how any academics or scientists or experts who speak out against gender ideology are, in some ways have their lives ruined, both professionally and their personal lives.
Right.
I talk about how I left academia because I wasn't willing to stay quiet, which is why I'm a journalist now, which I'm very grateful for. I know that you're probably not the biggest fan of journalists, but I do try to be as objective as possible.
Well,
And
no, I'm a fan of actual journalism, yeah. But, how much of that do we really see these days?
it's rare. Yeah. So I think like you said, also that just the fact that now students, I mean, my sense is incoming students are entitled to some degree. They expect to, if they want a particular grade, they expect that that's the grade they're going to get, whether or not they actually deserve it or if they've worked for it, or even if they do that well, whether or not they score that on their assignments and their exams. And they also expect not to be challenged in their ideas.
Yeah,
And
imagine
so
that. Imagine that being the expectation. That's like,
there's no point going to university in my
yeah.
mind if that's what you think.
I mean, I guess
And
from somebody that's been both through undergraduate and a graduate program, and then taught, and then on the other side, I don't know if I would call you an academic critic in the same way that some people are media critics that are actually journalists. But I mean, for more or less, that's you're bordering on that kind of position. So you've seen this from all angles, right? It's what exactly is the point of the university system? Because it used to be to train you for a trade or a skill, right? To be an attorney or a doctor or something like that. But now it seems like it's just a sycophant factory.
yeah, well, I mean, ideally you would go in, and this is what I appreciated about my training, is that you are taught how to think critically about the world. So especially if you're doing a study, the goal of the study is not to plan at the start what you're going to find. The goal is to say, this is what I'm curious to know about. Here's what I think. This is my hypothesis. But if my hypothesis is wrong, that's okay too. And I'm just going to present what I find, and we'll go from there. But now what you see is people go in and they have a predetermined outcome that they want to have or find, and then they reverse engineer everything to support that. So it's the same thing. I think when you go into classes as a student now, you see if there are particular things or themes or topics that you're allowed to talk about and that you're not allowed to talk about, especially when it comes to particular identity markers. I'm amazed at what I've been seeing in terms of the professors who are being sanctioned, losing their jobs over, just in my mind, doing their jobs as professors. So it's just crazy because this definitely is affecting where we are culturally right now, because these students graduate and they go on and they get normal, so-called normal jobs, and then they impose this on everybody else.
Right. I mean, you see people going into like the tech workspaces and bringing what would be considered like a fringe ideology and trying to promote it as commonplace. And I wonder if I don't know if you're familiar with Shaw's pathway methodology. It was a study almost in criminology back in the day, and the premise was that there are certain inflection points in a human being's life that makes them quote unquote break bad or break good, whatever it happens to be. One of the primary studies was on criminality in general, and then one of the studies I believe was on transnational terrorism. It's like at what point does this child or young adult or at whatever point become radicalized, and what can we do to interdict that? And I think that's something that we've tried to apply to crime prevention in America to a lesser degree. We haven't done a very good job of it, but it is an interesting situation. So where do you think the foot has to be put down, for lack of a better phrase, to stop this shit from happening? Right? I mean, I think, but because of how active kids on social media are and how they're getting kind of indoctrinated with a lot of this stuff, and there's social currency tied to, being woke, being on the right side of history, or being a victim, or whatever else, so young in life. Like, where do we fucking stop this stuff? What's the best point, in your opinion, to stop that?
Ideally, this would have just never gotten off the ground, but I
Right,
think,
yeah.
especially now, it it definitely has to start, I would say, before the kids even get to university. By that point, it's too late. I mean, I wrote in the book about how these ideas are targeting kids in kindergarten, which is really disturbing. I mean, it's very smart. I always say, these activists are very, very clever in the way that they've gone about marketing their ideas, because when you get kids at that age, they have no idea. They don't know any better. And in many cases, parents have no idea what's going on in the classroom as well. So I would say, I mean, I always tell people just not to worry about being called hateful or bigoted, as hard as that is. If you know in your heart that you are not any of those things, you don't have anything to be worried about or to be ashamed of. And there's really nothing wrong with speaking up against it, because I mean, we're just going, otherwise we're just going to continue going down this path. And
Right.
it's really not a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I was privy to and somewhat part of some studies that were done in Southern California about 15 years ago. What year is this? No, like 10 years ago. They kind of looked into the benefits of it was basically a study that was done to be anti-charter school at the time. If you're familiar with that in America, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but it's kind of like taxpayer subsidized special school for more gifted people.
Right.
In some cases, or maybe it's a little more of a niche education, like you get to choose a trade or a skill that you really want to get to. Anyways, that doesn't matter. The study kind of reflected on all different classes, gender, race. I don't remember all the subcategories, but it was a pretty exhaustive study, and the parental involvement turned out to be the most prominent factor in the success of the child, regardless of their race, how poor or rich they were, whatever the case was, right? So I wonder now, it's interesting to see that just you off the cuff saying that parents don't really know what the kids are being taught right now. And here in America, I'm sure you've followed when they ask and get angry that their kids are being taught weird shit. The Department of Justice starts investigating them, which seems kind of weird, right? I mean, it seems like a lot of, and I can't tell if it's just from social pressure or because it's faddish or whatever. It seems like a lot of people and institutions, whether it's universities or the government in some cases, certainly in the media, are taking part in the defense of these ideologies. And I can't understand why. I mean, I know the media wants to drum up controversy as often as possible because that's if it bleeds, it leads. That's kind of that's the CNN motto. But I don't know. Usually, when you invest yourself as a human being or an institution in something so much, there's a goal attached to it. People don't just do things for no reason, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think people find a way to derive meaning from these ideas as meaningless and senseless as they are. But what you're saying about parental involvement, I definitely agree with. And I think that is part of what we're seeing, especially with, I have a chapter in the book about transitioning in young children, and especially with the wave of young girls. So individuals born female who are very suddenly identifying as male. A lot of them are struggling with other mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the best relationship with their family, so they don't really have a support system. So they go on the internet to try and understand what it is they're feeling. And in some cases, it's just very normal discomfort with their bodies that's associated with puberty. In some cases, they have, history of sexual trauma. They may be on the autism spectrum. Some of them are lesbian and not comfortable with that. They don't have anyone in their life that they can really talk to about that. So when you go on the internet and you're posting questions in forums and you have strangers who are looking for new recruiters for their movement, they're very vulnerable in that way. So I think that's one way in which definitely I'd say parental involvement is important. I mean, I think that should go without saying, but you can't say that. And like you said, you get accused of being racist
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, sexist, say, if you, or even a traditionalist, which for myself, I would consider myself to be a classical, not, I wouldn't say necessarily even classical liberal. I say old school liberal. Like I would say I'm even still progressive on some issues, but I don't think any of that really matters. To me, it's just looking at things from a lens of what makes sense. And as a former scientist, what is backed by the evidence. But yeah, especially with, I understand parents and their concern with what's going on lately with all the racial stuff that's going into the education. I mean, I really feel for you guys. It hasn't really come up here as much, but it's definitely on its way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it is. I guess maybe the reason it hasn't really hit home up there is because your prime minister does blackface on a regular basis. So they don't want to get into that conversation. But yeah, I mean, to on that note, one of the points you make in the book is that the vast majority, and I'm not talking about 65%, but like in the high 90s of quote unquote gender dysphoric children, as adults end up identifying as their birth sex, right? So it seems like there's some kind of conflict socially at a young age where people are struggling with identity. And I think some of the points you made, one of them was that it might be easier for the woman who I guess trends masculine to just identify as a man rather than deal with the social pariah or becoming a social pariah as a female that doesn't do like girly things or something like that. That's a really good point to make, and it brings me back to the coddling of the American mind. Prepare your children for the road, not the road for your children. I think that's one of the most profound statements on parenting or leadership that I've ever heard in my life, and we seem to not give a fuck about that. You know what I mean? A lot of people have completely lost the will. They have no appetite for any kind of struggle in their life. But struggle is what makes life, right? I mean, everything we know about the best things in life are that they come at the future often comes at the price of the present, and that's taught in every major religion. It's taught in every major non-religious or irreligious philosophy. And somehow, I mean, I know a lot of it is postmodernism and Foucault's nonsense that, nothing is nothing, everything is whatever you want it to be, your lived experience is reality and all that stuff. But, man, it seems like we're trending in the wrong direction. And it's nice to see a lot of academics such as yourself standing up against this. But where are the academics that are still employed by the universities that are doing this? I mean, Brett and Heather got drummed out of town, basically. And frankly, they should have received a much larger settlement, but I know they're just not greedy people. So, but it seems like I always tell people that are fans of our shows that you should certainly police your own first, right? Like if you want to have an honest conversation with the other side, apply the principle of charity. Like take them at their best meaning and don't try to convince everybody that they're full of shit. And then when your side is intentionally misunderstanding things to be an asshole, for lack of a better word, I guess. You got to call them out on that. Where is that rise up from within academia? I mean, I guess Peterson's still employed, but Boghossian is no longer employed there, right? I mean, it seems like there's, and it's not just in academia; it's also in the corporate world. Somebody says something a little off color, does something, and all of a sudden they're a pariah and they've got to go. And these billion-dollar multinational companies are changing internal policies based on like 25 people on Twitter, which isn't, as Dave Chappelle, which isn't, as Chappelle says, a real place. So it seems like there's such a weird group of people working together to make life harder than it needs to be in these ways. And then there's also this weird group of people that are fighting back against it. So it seems like it seems to me like it's going back. I think it's trending in a good direction because people are starting to organize themselves by the way they think instead of by the way they look, right, and believe, which I think is a super important thing. And it's what is it? Well, I don't know. Let me hear your thoughts on that. I've been talking for too long now.
Sure. Well, I would say when you're asking about so I would have to say, I love Brett and Heather. I think they're fantastic. In terms of why more academics aren't speaking up, I hate to say it, but I do think cowardice might be a little bit of it. I mentioned that it's very, very stressful to be an academic and it is very competitive. But at the same time, I think if everyone who was not in agreement with this stood up, we would not be where we are. At the same time, there is such a skew in academia and so much political discrimination against conservatives and right-leaning people that in some ways I don't really blame them for not wanting to speak up because they are such a minority. I believe it was one of John Haidt's studies, and he showed that there's something like a bias of 1 to, it's a crazy ratio. I can't think of the top of my head. It's in my book. There's such a leftward bias in academia. But even if you're not conservative, the fact that many academics think it's okay to discriminate against a colleague because they hold different political views, to me, that's not okay. And to me, I'm thinking, why are you in academia if you're so closed-minded? Because the whole point of being there is to try and get at the truth and try to understand the world as it is. And it really doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, because the truth is what the truth is. So sometimes that's going to upset people on the left, and sometimes that's going to upset people on the right. And then in terms of, I'm thinking the other part of your question, people who are speaking up. Oh, and also in corporations, when you see your colleague being taken out, if you know that person is not sexist or racist, like I'm not saying this to your audience, obviously, just to their colleagues, why wouldn't someone stand up for them? It comes down to this lack of moral courage and this unwillingness for people to stick their neck out, because I think they're afraid, well, if I say something, then I'm going to be next. But the reality is everybody is next. No one is safe in this moment because they will go after anyone who disagrees, and that will be everyone at some point, even their so-called allies. They will turn on each other.
Yeah, big time. I mean, it's the first they came for the socialists, right? This is a very old poem. I'm sure you're familiar with that, right? First they came for the socialists, and I was a socialist, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's we've spent so much time, I say this a lot, but we spend so much time debating over right and left that we forgot to remember what right and wrong is. And
that's true.
It's I don't know. There's certainly a risk aversion, and it's not. I think it permeates all of society. It's not even just about woke culture and accepting that shit in academia or in the corporate world, but also in parenting. Like people are less likely. I mean, Brett and Heather talk about it a lot. People are less likely to let their children take minor risk and stuff like that. Safetyism, obviously, is what it's called, but it's everywhere, and it's not just about ideology. It's about fear. I think people are afraid of everything, and it seems so. There's a number of ways to handle fear, right? And I would like to hear your because my understanding of fear is more about being in war and shit like that, and your understanding of fear is more about discovering your identity and being okay with that internally, and also facing society and growing as a human being and stuff like that. So there are ways to deal with fear. You can bury your head in the sand, right? Pretend nothing's wrong, but bad news doesn't get better with time. That's one of the things I used to tell my soldiers all the time. Like, if something's fucked up, you better come tell me, because it's not getting any better just by ignoring it. It's like cancer, right?
Yeah.
And then you can, you know, create delusions for yourself, or moralize things or whatever, or you can deal with the fucking problem, right? One of the things I like to say is that the weight doesn't get any lighter; you get stronger. So there's got to be a lot of overlap between developing personality, and I don't think the bullying that leads to like suicide and shit like that. I think we might be having the wrong conversation around that stuff. I think we might be having a conversation about we need to protect our kids from bullying instead of teaching them how to deal with that. Would you agree with that? And please, in your response, expand on what it was like for you developing your identity as a child, figuring out who you are, how you handled that situation, and what advice you might have for other people doing the same
Sure.
thing.
Well, I would say with, say, the larger trend of people being worried and anxious about things, I do think anxiety, the concept of anxiety, is really overused nowadays. Just like the word trauma, people talk about trauma over really insignificant things, which I think trivializes people who really have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't think that's something to make light of. Or anxiety. You know, anxiety can be really debilitating for some people. I think it's good that the conversation about mental health has opened up and that there is less stigma around it. But I think also sometimes people will use these labels as a way to get validation or attention, which is, to me, really distasteful. So I would say for, say, anxiety, if you look at it from a psychological perspective, I don't do clinical work anymore, but the way clinicians will generally treat anxiety is through exposure. It's called exposure therapy. So whatever it is you're afraid of, they will expose you to it in increasingly larger amounts so that you eventually habituate and get used to it. So it doesn't create the same fear response in a person. But what you're seeing now, especially with the safetyism in our culture, is that it's considered acceptable for someone who is afraid or uncomfortable with something to be shielded from that thing.
Right.
So what happens over time is that person learns, this thing makes me uncomfortable. If I avoid it, I feel better. So they'll continue to do that. But that actually is not going to be helpful for them because they're never going to challenge the actual fear that they have and never overcome it, or realize that the fear that they have is not actually beneficial or even necessary. So I think that's a big part of what we're seeing in terms of, say, people who don't want to be exposed to ideas they don't like. And especially with the internet now, you can find someone you agree with. If it's, say, a public intellectual, even, you can find somebody who is saying the things that you agree with, who may be completely wrong. But if you don't want to be challenged or you don't want to be made uncomfortable with your ideas, you can avoid that throughout life and completely demonize the other side and have no interest in understanding them, which I don't think is a really honest way of approaching it if you really genuinely want to understand these issues and want to know that you're right. I don't think it's enough to just believe that a person's correct. They should really seek out information that is going to potentially prove them wrong, so
Right,
that
yeah,
they know
yeah.
that they're right.
I think that's a really important distinction. You should want, and maybe this is something we need to spend more time teaching younger children in like primary education, which is, it's not important that you're right. It's important that you have the right answer. I think that might sound I don't know, insipid maybe, but I think that's a very important distinction, because what we have this, and you see it in the media as well. We have this, there's social currency tied to being first to report something or know something, regardless of if it's correct or not. And I would just like to remind everyone that everything you know, you learned from somebody else, and that is true for every single human being that hasn't made some kind of scientific discovery or created something from nothing else. Like even the fundamentals of your new product, if that's what it is, you built on the intelligence or knowledge or work of somebody else. So I don't understand why people's egos get so wrapped up in that part of it. Being correct, like, oh, I'm the one that's correct. Who gives a shit? Like, we're all wrong about whatever topic it is. We're wrong or ignorant until we are correct. Everybody, forever, in the whole history of intelligent life, that is how it goes. So I think that's something we really need to enforce at the youngest possible level. Yes.
Yeah, and I was going to
Thoughts?
say also when people are clearly wrong, like say when there is a correction in the media, people will still cling on to whatever the previous idea was because they were just refuse to concede, which I don't know, I don't know what the point of that is because it's not actually helpful. But what you were saying in terms of what I've found helpful, I think for me, the ability, oh, what I also wanted to say actually with that is with the news, I mean, people are so busy, understandably. Like, I feel this is what I find disappointing about journalism in this moment is that people have to seek out multiple sources to really know whether reportage is accurate. And I always tell people to look at sources on the left and the right because the truth usually is going to be somewhere in the middle between. Or you even just understand, say you're on the left to understand a conservative's perspective, or if you're on the right to understand a progressive's perspective. But it shouldn't be like that, you know. And it shouldn't be up to the news consumer to have to vet and look at primary sources. But that is something I would recommend, and especially when it comes to say science journalism, a lot of the time, especially the headlines are usually not at all accurate. But even when you read the article, the coverage in many cases misrepresents the actual study. So I will tell people if you can really try to seek out the original papers, which is difficult because they're usually against paywalls. You know, in my book, I list all the citations, the studies I talk about, so people can look them up if they want to read them for themselves. So they don't even have to trust me in terms of my interpretation or what I'm saying. They
Right.
can look at the primary information. But what I would say for myself and my experience, I would say being able to separate the ideas you have about the world and what you hope the world will be or what you want the world to be from what it actually is.
Right.
And so I talk about that in the book as well, because that can be very uncomfortable because say if you are in favor of a particular social change and you realize that, okay, there are particular lies that you can tell to society to facilitate that change. Is that an honorable thing to do? And I would say for activists, I mean, I can't speak for all of them, but that seems to be very much their approach. It's like these so-called noble lies that they tell because that's going to evoke sympathy or make people more likely to be on board with their cause.
Right.
But ultimately, the truth always comes out. And especially when there is information that comes out that proves that what they're saying is dishonest, I think that really undermines what they are trying to achieve. So I think for myself, just being able to separate any idealistic goals from what you actually see in the world, and then find a way for, okay, from what you see in the world that doesn't necessarily justify discrimination or whatever it is people are afraid of with
Right,
that
yeah.
information. Because I don't think controversial ideas should be avoided, or I don't think people should ever be afraid also of trying to just understand their own beliefs, because I think some people even self-censor in their own minds. They don't want to go certain places because they're afraid of what that might say about them. And I just think we should never worry about any of that. As long as your intentions as a human being are good, I don't think you should ever fear ideas.
Right. Now you're talking about the is ought thing, right? Like David Hume, where certain people think about the way the world is, and certain people think about the way the world ought to be, and they conflate. Some folks conflate the two, right? And they believe, well, this is the way it should be. And a lot of people think that about the work that you do, the gender and sexuality stuff, not just on the woke side, but also on the, I don't want to call it prudish religious side because I don't want to denigrate that, but there are some people that are very judgmental of other people's behavior without any real right to be. We're a staunchly non-kink shaming organization over here. Provided everyone's consenting adults.
TM.
Yeah, yeah. You guys trademarked that. Did you hear her? Pay attention, goddammit. Yeah, but I think that leads into the is odd thing. For me, leads into something else. One of our listeners commented, which is, I'm going to paraphrase them because I think this is a better way to say it. But what are your thoughts on how people identify as different things? Like there's even in religion, there's there are observant Orthodox Jews, there are cultural Jews, there are people who are just Jewish, which a buddy of mine made a joke about last night when we were at dinner. And then there's, the spectrum of things that people identify as on the gender part. And I don't think necessarily any of that stuff is harmful, provided they're not, deluding themselves or harming themselves. But our people, they have a very strong sense of social justice. And I don't mean in the way that it's interpreted these days. I mean that a lot of our folks are first responders that have seen a lot of really horrible, devastating things. A lot of us, myself included, have been to very bad places on earth and seen what real violence and poverty looks like. So we don't want to see that shit. It's a human being watching other human beings suffer. I think that should affect you in some way, and I believe it does in most cases. And how do you recommend people like that? We don't want to be forced to participate in anybody's delusion. I'll say that. But I also don't want to be presumptuous about how someone's feeling, because we've all dealt with different things, especially the military and first responder community with the invisible wounds, you know what I mean, things like that, and post-traumatic stress. There's a lot that goes on there. How would you recommend that a straight layperson that doesn't know about these things approach someone or interact with someone that has some of these pretty radical beliefs? I don't think it does anybody any good for us to say you're a freak, shut the fuck up, right? Like there has to be some kind of conversation, and I don't think it can be focused on just changing their mind. I think you got to hold people accountable to reality, but if you go into that conversation trying to convince somebody that identifies as something that they're not really, that probably won't go well, right?
No, they probably will get defensive. I would say the most important thing, and this is something that I really advocate just with my work more broadly, is to really not be judgmental as much as possible. Even though some of these ideas, especially with gender, are so ludicrous. I mean, in the book I list like however many, I don't know, at this point there are probably like billions of genders, right? But all the different variations that someone might identify as, it's usually there's something else going on beneath the surface, and that person is suffering emotionally, and that this is a way for them to, I guess, express that to the world. In some cases, people are just using these labels as a way to get attention and to get people to pay attention to them or think that they're special. But I do think especially for younger people, they're using these labels as a way to convey that there's something that they're struggling with. So compassion, I think, is very important.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
I've had some people say that, how can you be so mean to these people who, I mean, I don't think I'm mean, but they'll say, how can you be criticizing these people and their gender labels when, say, for political pundits, we are very particular about how we identify politically. And I say, well, because your political label helps people understand, I think, where you're coming from, and also I would say that, just where you're coming from. And so that is important and that's relevant to my profession. But how you identify in terms of your gender, especially when it's not backed by any science or evidence, I think you have a right to question that. And especially, so we were talking about before we went on air about, changes that are happening in Canada.
Right.
And there's a bill that is now going into law that criminalizes any therapeutic interventions that are not affirmation when it comes to gender identity. So if someone goes in to see a therapist and they want to transition, the therapist has to affirm them. They cannot question that. The therapist can face up to 5 years in prison.
Oh my God.
And now with this law, they've actually amended it to say that even if an adult wants to seek out treatment about gender identity and basically, that's not affirmation, they cannot consent to that. So this goes beyond children. Before it was about protecting children. And so I want to clarify with these conversion therapy bills. So I am not in favor of conversion therapy for sexual orientation, because gay and bisexual people cannot be made to be straight, because sexual orientation is immutable. It is biological. Some people get mad at me when I say that, but it is true. I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to that.
Yeah, that was actually, I know that wasn't the full point of your book, but that was one of the more interesting, because my stepkid is, he'll be 14 in like 2 weeks, gay male kid, right? And I don't really give a shit one way or the other, but it is interesting to hear all of the the biological reasons, the exposure to testosterone in the wound and stuff like that. I had
Hmm.
no idea that any of that was the case. I mean, the presumption is because we all knew kids like that when we were growing up. Like that dude's definitely there's something different about him. We didn't know how to
Hmm.
categorize it back then, but that part and all the data that you provide on that was really interesting. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, you know what's crazy though, because gay rights activists for a long time were saying that being they were born this way, being gay is not a choice, which is true. That is what
Right.
evidence shows. But now you have activists who are saying that sexual orientation is a choice because they're trying to undermine everything and dismantle everything. So that's something I never thought I'd ever see is seeing activists who claim to care about gay people saying that they're being gay is a choice. But so what I was saying with
Hmm.
these bands, so what happens with gender identity is different from sexual orientation. Gender identity can change over the lifespan, especially in children, as you mentioned, because the vast majority of those who are gender dysphoric, who say they identify more as the opposite sex than
Hmm.
their birth sex, they're more likely to actually grow up to be gay in adulthood. So they're not going to be transgender. If you have a little boy who is very feminine, who says he wants to be a girl, he's more likely to grow up to be a gay man. So it doesn't help to criminalize any therapies that try to understand why someone is experiencing gender dysphoria because people are going to transition, they're going to regret it and detransition, which is exactly what we're seeing right now because there's a complete lack of gatekeeping, medical gatekeeping. I do think I mean, I want to say I support transitioning in adults. I do think in the past, trans people have had to face unfair obstacles and
Hmm.
gatekeeping with regard to their care. But now we've gone completely in the opposite direction. And the thing is, activists have been smart to call these bans conversion therapy bans because no one wants to
Right.
be against conversion therapy bans because they think of the association with sexual orientation and
Hmm.
they think, well, that's wrong. So I should be on board with banning so-called conversion therapy for gender identity as well. But there's a difference there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's. I think it seems like with this, as in pretty much everything else these days, there are there's a large group of people who just don't understand anything that's happening and probably don't even care, to be honest. There's a large group of people who want to be actively empathetic, and then there are some fringe elements that drag the goodwill of those actively empathetic people into these cesspools of anti-science nonsense. And I wonder if it's, obviously getting dragged into stuff like that. You should certainly be, particularly if you're in an institution that has some kind of power. I would say that academia does because it's shaping young minds, and corporations do it because they're on the world stage. The media certainly as well. But if you're in one of those positions of power, you definitely have some responsibility to stand up to nonsense. But I do think, and I hate to invoke Richard Nixon here because he was kind of a piece of shit. But he did make some good points about the silent majority and how uh, liberty comes at a price, and we've all achieved liberty in our minds, and we're no longer fighting for it. So the silent majority is this group of people who have reached the finish line and aren't looking back for other people. Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, and I say this on the show all the time, you've got two hands for a reason, one to pull yourself up and one to pull the next guy up with you. And that goes for helping people through life, but it also goes to holding society accountable to reasonable standards, right? Because ultimately, this is the backdrop of all of our lives, the laws that get created, the economic circumstances that get created. These things only exist in a good way if they exist for everybody. So it seems like this fringe element on the left is now just tearing at the underbelly of the institutions that protect all of us, right? Like masculinity, for example. The point of that evolutionarily is to provide and protect. It's not to, and sometimes those provisions come from fucking somebody else up. Historically, I'm not saying that I co-sign all that stuff, but, being able to go out and hunt things and, just historically, that's been a big deal for our species to be able to survive and shit like that. It seems very, very self-destructive. I can't tell if it's just revenge because these people have been treated poorly for so long, or if it's some kind of, if it's like The Happening from Stephen King, where we all become like passively suicidal instead of the plants making is actually suicidal, or what it is. What do you think that is? What it's I know there's a lot of complex things going. There's social currency tied to being on the right side of history and being a victim and blah blah blah. But it can't just be that. It can't just be that. It's got to be something bigger than that, right?
I think it is, and I don't want to be flippant, sound flippant by saying this, but I do think in some cases it is people who have some severe underlying psychopathology that is not being addressed, and people are, empathic to that, and they are going to listen to them and accommodate them when really they should be challenged. I think in some cases, especially people with personality disorders, are running wild right now and are really being emboldened by where we are culturally. And I mean, I just look at some of the interactions I see. I don't want to name names, obviously, but it's just as someone who has worked in the past with patients with personality disorders, I get a vibe of what's going on, and I just think these are people who need to be challenged and need to be told that their way of viewing the world is not acceptable, and that people should not be capitulating to them, but instead they're getting what they want, and so other people see, okay, well, this is what I need to do to get ahead and to be recognized, instead of just doing good work, putting your head down, working hard, which is harder to do. It's not as rewarding in a short time frame, but is, I think, a more honest and ethical and ultimately fruitful way to live your life. And also in terms of, say, personal growth and just resilience and being a decent human being.
Right.
But it seems like people are very much operating at a much shorter, condensed time scale, and they want that reinforcement and they want that reward much more quickly. And so they're seeing, especially when you see, I'm sure people are sick of hearing about cancel culture, but anytime this happens now, it's always about someone who is less successful going after someone who's really successful. And then if they get what they want, other people say, okay, well, that worked for them. That's what I'm going to do next time. Because why wouldn't you? If it's that easy to get recognition and attention by tearing down someone else instead of doing good work and creating something useful with your platform, then why wouldn't? People are incentivized definitely to this bad behavior.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of social media accounts that exist only to quote unquote expose other people, but this person that does the exposing has never actually done anything in themselves, which is interesting, right? Because usually critics are somebody that should be at least somewhat knowledgeable about what they're talking about, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It's just like a notch on your belt to take somebody down. And on the hard work thing, I think that a culture of hard workers is a reflection of an overarching belief that society and systems are working for you. And when people don't feel that way, they stop working hard. It's the fundamental flaw of communism, obviously, despite the authoritarian shit that happens in there. This is the reason that economic style or that full-blown socialism just will never work, right? Because people need purpose in their life. And if the purpose becomes the state, anytime they disagree with the state, their purpose gets challenged. Maybe they're in prison and blah, blah, blah. If the purpose is, I think all of these decisions need to be made at the lowest possible level. That's why I'm a big fan of the Federalist Papers, and I'm a big fan of the way we originally set up our government to operate. Not that it does that anymore, but it seems like a lot of people just don't believe that the system works for them anymore. And maybe that's because it doesn't. Maybe it's because the media has told them that it doesn't, or whatever. I think cultural poverty, or generational poverty, can create that as well. And you see generational poverty victims, I guess, of generational poverty have much higher crime rates than any other groups of people. And I think that's probably one of the key indicators of that happening. So one of the things that I think we might need to do is start to, one, make the systems actually work, because I don't think they do in a lot of ways, but also empower people, right? Like, you have the ability to go affect these things. And I don't mean by voting and shit like that for these, pardon my language, but all politicians are cunts in my mind. I hate them. I think they're the worst people on earth. But my theory is to box out the government, right? If you see a problem in your field of view, go fix that problem so some dude with a clipboard and the ability to tax people doesn't show up and try to fix it for you, because they are not going to get it done. I mean, go to the DMV if you believe that shit, right? So how do you feel like we can take that from a political and economic ideology of empowering people and empower people in thinking, like critical thought again?
Well, I would say a big part of that is just to be self-motivated, because I think it's very easy for people to want to blame something externally. So to either blame their situation or blame someone else or blame whatever it is. Life is inherently difficult and it's unpredictable. And I think even when I just think of my own path throughout navigating all of this stuff, it's just been, for me, what's helped me the most is just to say, like, I'm not in control of any of this, but I know that what I choose to do with it is going to make a difference. So I would say that's what I've found helpful. But in terms of, say, like a return to rationality in science, like you said, I don't think most people are actually in agreement with any of what's happening. It's just that it's very difficult for them to speak out about it. In my most recent episode of my podcast with Megan Dam, so she's a very well-known journalist, she's amazing. We talked about this, and I think for some of us, we've built our lives in a way that we can navigate this, but it's definitely a more difficult path. And I don't blame people who say have, a mortgage and a family and they've got all this other stuff going on, that if they say something that's unpopular, they're going to pay the price for that in a really awful way. So, for those of us who do speak out, for me, I'm always thinking 6 steps ahead, like what's going to happen next and how can I avoid these things? For me, just the feeling of being able to say what I genuinely think makes it all worth it. But I don't judge someone who's in a situation where it's more difficult for them, and maybe they do stay quiet for that reason. But I would say, even if you have to stay quiet, be firm about where you stand. Don't ever question your own interpretation of things. And I would say also, with the people in your life, you might not be able to control what you can or can't say at work, but in your personal life, at least, I would say really try to push back, because I would think it's important to have people in your life. They don't have to agree with you, but just be open-minded enough to accept you and love you for who you really are instead of who they think you are. And I really feel for anyone because I hear from people all the time who tell me this, that they can't say what they think their family or friends are going to disown them. And I just think that's so sad.
Yeah, that's weird.
I can't imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, but I've got a lot of friends who are now estranged from family members over political ideologies that have no actual effect on their day-to-day lives, which is really fucking weird. I mean, it's Sam Harris used to make a good point about it. It's not really relevant here, but he used to say it's about atheism, actually. But he said if somebody told you that your spouse was cheating on you, you would believe them only up to the point that they could provide evidence to that effect. And if somebody just tells you that there's an invisible man in the sky or something, you will just believe that because you were taught it. And I think he wasn't criticizing religion so much as he was commenting on the way we believe things, right? And he goes on to elucidate more in that and Waking Up and some other books he wrote. But I think the way we believe things is really interesting, and I think it's maybe not as adaptive as we thought it was. It seems like people, like you said, get bogged down with the everyday rigors of life and don't have the time to develop these schema to like interpret information and what is and isn't reality. So they just, the news was the news for a long time. And not that it hasn't been manipulated through history, but more or less, they were pretty.
It was more balanced.
Yeah, it was certainly more balanced, and there was a lot more delivery of fact without opinion. I don't know if we even have any news organizations left. Even the AP is printing what is effectively opinion columns, although they call it analysis, which is interesting to use that word. But the way we believe things and stuff like that, I think it's we have to come back eventually to some kind of conditioning, whether it's Pavlovian or otherwise, because it seems like all these folks, it's one or the other. What you described, people that are afraid to speak out because they're going to lose something, or people who speak out with the woke stuff because they know that they're going to be rewarded for it, or victimhood, they're going to be rewarded for it. We need to start probably rewarding people for being honest with themselves, admitting their mistakes, changing their opinions when they receive new data, being open-minded. That's probably the first step. I just don't know how to do that in a way that's going to grab people's attention. You know what I mean? And I don't mean to. I don't mean to sound conspiratorial or anything, like we're trying to trick people into thing or anything like that. But to get in front of eyeballs, you have to be somewhat entertaining. That's just the way life works, right?
To get the attention. But then the unfortunate side effect of that potentially is that people will discount someone because they are leaning into that, because they'll say, well, if they had a point, do they really need to take it to this level?
Right.
I know I think about this all the time, because I think there definitely needs to be more of an incentive for people to speak out about this and to push back. But I think it's like anything, over time there will be a sufficient mass, and it can't continue indefinitely like this. It's just a question of what is going to be the damage left behind as a result of it. But I do think even in personal conversations, I feel at this point, if people are not awake and not aware that something is going on and they're not skeptical, at least a little bit, I don't know if they can really be woken up in that way. But I do think of people who are starting to see things more clearly. You can probably navigate a bit within that. It's just a matter of doing it in a way that is, like we were saying earlier, if you steal someone's argument and really give them the benefit of the doubt and really try to hear what they're saying and allow them to know that you hear what they're saying, like repeat back what they're saying in the most charitable way so that they feel that they are being heard. You can probably, hopefully, make a little bit of change that way.
Right, but you also have to be careful to not nurture an unhealthy type of skepticism, like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that there's the Israelis are putting lasers in space to cause forest fires and shit. Like that seems that's a member of Congress in America, by the way, that said that. That seems weird, right? That's
right.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, and
I like lasers, but
I'm a big fan of lasers as well. I can't. There's a name, Rappaport's rule, I think is what it's called, or something like that, where you. Jordan Peterson talks about it a lot, where you, in his counseling sessions, he'll often have two arguing parties. One will have to repeat back the other's point to them to their satisfaction.
Right.
Like, you truly understand what I'm saying.
Marital therapy.
Yeah. So I think that's certainly an interesting thing, but all of our conversations have been, there seems to be no beginning, middle, and end to conversations anymore. There's just like little blips in your personal life, social media, and stuff like that, and they all conflate into what you believe. And I don't know if you gave somebody a pen and paper and told them to sit down and write the thing, like what they actually believe about 10 different subjects. I'm not sure if people could do that in a way that was really readable, frankly. Like I don't know if people actually know what they believe right now.
Yeah, I don't know that they know either, and it's pretty amazing actually, because I'm thinking about conversations that I've had. Sometimes if you ask basic questions, they can't answer them. It's really about being on this team or that team and cheering when your team does well and booing when the other team tries to make a point, which is not at all helpful.
Well, it can be helpful if your team is like justice, like real justice and empathy and making sure that people have food. Like we can all celebrate victories when there's some kind of natural disaster in Indonesia, for example, and the American public gives more money to the individuals in Indonesia than all the other governments did, right? Like they just charitable donation. That's a win for everybody, but we don't celebrate that. You know what I mean? I don't know why. One of the things our folks wanted to ask is about, and I think it's a good next point, because all the things we're talking about, some of them can be kind of just annoying. Some of them can really affect people's lives. And now when this, I don't know if it's a reflection of postmodernism or just whatever, but it seems like it's made its way into government pretty well now. And like Dr. Fauci, for example, saying, like when people are attacking science, they're attacking me. That is a really weird thing for a scientist to say. Because you've been to a number of scientific gatherings, I imagine, symposiums and talks and things like that. And what you'll see, especially on a panel, is, and this is particularly true in physics, but pretty much anywhere, if there are other experts there and somebody asks one of the panel members a question about something and it goes outside of their area of expertise, they immediately start to hedge and be like, well, Mr. or Mrs. whatever or Dr. whomever will know more about this than me.
Yeah.
They won't be like, they won't get into an argument. Like you're not going to see an engineer get into an argument with a like a planetary scientist about something. It just won't happen. So calling yourself the science, like proper noun, the science, that seems a little bizarre to me, frankly, especially when a lot of the decisions being made are, like you said, they're based on noble lies. I don't think the people are intrinsically evil. I think they think that everybody's stupid and that if they lie to them a little bit, they can get them to do stuff that might be beneficial, which is, that's a problem, right? That may have worked 100 years ago, but now everybody's got the goddamn internet.
Yeah. Well, just going back to your earlier point about even when we have wins that you think would be a collective win for humanity or for society, I feel like there are still people who are going to be mad because everything is so political now, and they will find a way to politicize it and make it into something about us versus them.
Isn't that funny? Do you ever get asked
cohesive.
do you ever get asked the question like how did people used to like how I don't know how your dad who's a Republican and your mom who is a Democrat ever got married in the first place? Like, well, nobody gave a fuck back then. I mean, they cared to some degree, but it didn't dominate their lives. It's like, oh, I'm a Democrat, so I drink Coke. Like, no, you just drink whatever the fuck you want because that's what you like, asshole, right? I mean, we've gotten so niche in the political spectrum now. It's so weird.
Yeah, and it's happened so fast too. But going to your point about the quote unquote the science,
Right.
especially when it comes to COVID, I mean, I feel like there are particular narratives that seem to be considered quote the science, and then even if there is science that contradicts those narratives, that's not acceptable science. That becomes misinformation or disinformation. And I don't think science does evolve over time, and especially in a situation like a pandemic, which I do think should be taken seriously. I think people should be open to the fact that yes, things change over time, but when it seems like there's a political motivation behind why certain parts of the science are being lifted up or suppressed and parts of the science are being ignored, people have a right to be skeptical. And I think good scientists should have the humility to, like you said, admit when they don't know something, also to acknowledge when they've been wrong, because that's very important for public trust.
Right.
Which I'm not sure if we've been seeing that. So as a result, the public can feel, I think, very much lied to. If they see before their eyes that people are saying one thing, or why is it that it's acceptable for a certain group of people to say or do something, and it's not acceptable for another group of people to say or do something else just because they're of a different political faction.
Right.
So it's very dangerous to me. And that is another example, I think, of just how it's really, really bad when you start politicizing science.
I keep asking people this question, and I'm not sure I've received a satisfactory answer. And maybe that's because there isn't one, because I've asked quite a few smart people. And I'm going to maybe they'll come back to me later with an answer. I just want to pose it to you now. No pressure, by the way, because nobody's given me a great answer on this yet because it's such a weird question. But going back to something we talked about earlier, how do you incentivize people to care more about having the right answer than simply being right? I know that's
having
tough.
The right answer instead of being right.
Yeah, like instead of weaving being right into any particular subject into your personality or identity, just having the right answer is something we have. Like, people don't argue over basic mathematics because that's stupid, right?
Well, they do now, though, but don't they argue about 2 + 2 = 5?
That's stupid. But I mean, like, reasonable folks don't do that. And I think one of the schema you can build to shield people from falling into the rhetorical traps or the circular reasoning traps or whatever is to make it more beneficial for them to know the answer rather than to provide the answer or guess. Maybe is the better way to say that.
I think it's very natural for people to want to be right. I would say maybe it's a sense of integrity that needs to be built into children from a very young age before any of this stuff, before they're learning about anything. Just because I'm thinking, what differentiates being right versus having the right or the correct answer? And what is it people get from being quote unquote right or winning an argument,
Right.
even if what they're saying is not true.
Well, how did
Or
you
they
feel
know
though?
that what they're saying is not true.
Like
Or
how
what
did
they
you?
don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, how did you feel 3 or 6 months or however long it was into grad school when you started seeing primary research and maybe even conducting some secondary research on these issues and finding out that your beliefs were wrong? Like, how did that make you feel? I guess.
I remember being very disoriented
Mm,
and confused because initially I thought, okay, well, these people I'm working with are world experts, so they must be correct. But I mean,
mm,
obviously, it was also based on my reading of the research. But I had like say gender is a social construct because I
right.
think that was the myth that really everything has stemmed from since. And for me, I genuinely believed this before. And I thought, well, anyone who disagrees with this belief is a sexist. That's what I thought before, right? Because that's what feminism teaches young women,
Right. Yeah.
unfortunately. And then I thought, well, the people I'm working with don't seem sexist. And when I read these papers, they seem to make total sense. So wait a minute. It then makes you, and I think this is why a lot of people probably don't really want to go down this path because you start to then question everything that you have been told. So then from there, I was like, all right, well, if this is wrong, what else is wrong? What else does this say about, say, femininity and masculinity and the things I've been say? In the book I talk about how I used to be very feminist,
Hmm.
how feminism has taught what feminism teaches women about masculinity and femininity, and it then you have to really go through everything, and it can be very very uncomfortable
Hmm.
because it can completely change your worldview. So I think it also people need to be invested in wanting to really understand what else could be wrong and and really challenge themselves, which is not necessarily a comfortable process.
Yeah, for
But
sure. Yeah.
and to put the time in, it is time. It does take time, right, to
Hmm.
actually like go and investigate and think about these things and talk to people and try to get unbiased information. And it's also hard nowadays too because you see all this censorship happening.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's one of the things you said was really poignant. You said that in feminism, you're taught to think that somebody that doesn't have the bullet list of beliefs that you do are misogynist or anti-woman or
Yeah.
whatever, right? We have that tendency now, and maybe it's been there forever to frame anybody that has ideological differences as the enemy, and that can't be the case. Like in politics, in a political system, the right and the left aren't enemies. They're supposed to be teammates with different skill sets that are trying to address the real enemies, which are existential threats, poverty, disease, just natural disasters, I guess. The litany of things that are always trying to kill us and make our lives worse. Those are the enemies. That's how I feel like it. And maybe we're not doing a good job of personifying those because what we seem to do is almost anthropomorphize these issues and then assign a person to it. Like Donald Trump is the cause of racism, or Joe Biden is the cause of whatever. It just doesn't
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't track for me because that's a very reductive and silly way to think about the problems in life, and it's also not in any way helpful to immediately think of anybody that's ideologically opposed to you as your enemy, right?
Yeah. And I think also to take a step back and to realize that with this hostility and animosity and with the left and right constantly at each other's throats, that people are profiting from this and
Mm,
people are benefiting from it. And in some ways, it's also a really big distraction that is, again, benefiting some people, benefiting them financially. So to be aware of that I think some people like the combative aspect of politics and arguing about these things. I mean, for me, I try to imagine what it's like for someone who willingly chooses to get into fights with people about politics on social media, total strangers. I can't imagine spending my free time doing that. It's wild to me. So I think just that awareness that this is not conducive for us as a society and that this is a game that people are setting us up for that benefits them. It doesn't benefit us.
right, I agree with that. It certainly doesn't benefit the collective us. I mean, certainly not us individually. If your dopamine hits throughout the day are coming from that, then that's probably not good because now you're biologically preparing yourself to commit one of the worst sins in thought, in my opinion, which is confirmation bias, right? Like you can't
Mm-hmm.
get that dopamine hit unless you're right. That's a big fucking problem. I don't know how to reassign it though. I still maybe there's not anyway. Maybe it's just, and your answer is reflective of most of the ones I've heard, which is that uh, you know, turn the question back around on people, make them more responsible for elucidating the things they're actually saying. Like, tell me why you believe what you believe. And if they can't answer that question, if they just get defensive, then that conversation is pretty much over, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think also people, it's very difficult for some people to separate their opinions from their identity
Mm-hmm.
and their value as a human being. When I don't think your opinions necessarily say anything about you and your value as a person or your morality as a person. And I think opinions should be flexible and willing to change,
Right.
especially as you learn more information. But I think part of it too, just everyone we would do so much better if there was no such thing as social media.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, I would not be on any of these platforms if it wasn't for work. So it's been real. I mean, it's definitely beneficial in some ways for me as a columnist to see
Mm-hmm.
what's going on, how people talk about these issues, but also to be aware that, you know, not everything you see is real. And again, that in some ways it's being set up to pit us against each other.
Yeah. Twitter's got what, like 2 billion users, and
No,
how many?
like 300 to 500 million.
Oh, that's lower than I thought. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's say it's the entire population of the United States, because that's close, right? If you found out that 25 people in the entire United States had an issue with what you were doing, would that affect you in any real way? But somehow that same
Right.
amount of people are able to influence like corporate policy and American politics. And maybe it's not always such a small group, but it is. We're making these. I think it's the almost the inverse, or maybe the other side of the microwave culture. Everybody wants everything right now. That we're doing the same thing. We're creating like long-term solutions to very short-term problems. Like we're seeing COVID move into the endemic stage, where it's just going to be around a while, and or maybe forever, like the flu or the cold. And you still see not just governments, but people in the media really trying to establish it as a permanent existential threat that's serious, right? And it's just not the case anymore. So maybe it just falls into the maximum. People that get power very rarely give it up. You know, maybe that's it. Maybe it's like sand falling through their hands and they're trying to grip it because they've enjoyed the power, or they feel like they're still protecting people. I don't think that most people, most liberal people, and I like to distinguish between the left or leftists, which are like pretty lunatic folks, and liberals, because it's not even close to the same goddamn thing.
Yeah.
I don't think most of those people are bad people. I don't think that I don't even think a lot of the people on the fringe are bad people. I just think you're probably right. There's some personality disorders over there that need to be addressed. But I think a lot of people just moralize whatever they want to do. Like here's
Yeah.
what I want to do. I'm comfortable doing this. I enjoy doing this. I like the feedback I get from it. So I'm going to moralize it and make it part of my identity. And that doesn't seem like a very healthy way to. We're still pretty young in our evolution with regard to complex thought, in my opinion. Even though, I mean, Greek philosophy kind of led us to where we are today, but it's not, on the cosmic scale, it's not been very long. And it seems like we're in our terrible twos right now, maybe. We're going through that self-destructive phase where I'm going to keep crying even though it hurts. I'm going to I'm going to act out or whatever. Yeah. I mean, we're just throwing a collective tantrum. And what do you do when, your kid's throwing a tantrum? You certainly don't reward that behavior, but you also, you don't want to just leave them to their own devices either, because they're going to do something maybe irreversible and self-destructive.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, this idea that if you are compassionate, that you will agree with someone or basically let them do what they want, even if it's not good for them. Because I'm just going back to the earlier point, the audience question about people who are identifying as whatever they want in terms of their gender and what's the harm in that. Well, the harm is that, in some cases, these people are getting permanent medical interventions like surgery and taking hormones that are not going to make them feel better after they've transitioned. And so the short-term pain of them having to work through potentially what it is that's really leading them to feel distress is going to be probably more painful than a quick fix, but that's ultimately what's going to be better for them than to simply say, okay, this is what you want, we'll give it to you. And then 6 months or a year from now, you're going to be in the same place you're in right now, having to work through whatever it is that's really underlying the feelings you have. So why not do that now instead of doing this roundabout thing? But there's something in our society, I feel that it's being encouraged, or if you're compassionate, if you're supposedly a compassionate person, that you will give someone what they want, you won't push back against them. There's something about, I think, challenging people that is seen as cruel or is not how you're supposed to approach interactions. But I disagree with that, because like, I'm the type of person, I'm very blunt, and I like when people are honest, because to me, honesty tells you that someone really cares about you. It's much easier for people to lie to you and tell you what you want to hear.
I agree with that. That's certainly the coward's way out, to just accept someone else's premise and not challenge it. And it's the coward's way out to not do it to yourself as well. We really appreciate you coming on today. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate what you're doing in your work. Please tell everyone where they can find you and where they can find your publication and your podcast and all that stuff.
Yeah, so you can get The End of Gender. Probably the best place to get it is if you go to my website, which is Dr. Debra Soh. There are links to booksellers there. The audiobook, you can get it free on Audible, and it is read by me, as we mentioned. The Dr. Debra Soh podcast is available on all podcasting platforms. And on social media, I'm at Dr. Debra Soh. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate your time. All you guys go check out the book. It's really interesting. Even if you don't really care about any of these particular issues, you'll see some of the history about this, some of the biology behind it, and why some people have made some of the choices they've done, and maybe pick up some tips on how to talk to people and still be kind while challenging ideas. Again, we appreciate you coming on today. And as usual, we end the show by telling the audience we'll see them in hell. So we'll